Welcome to my user story mapping video course. My name is Christian Strunk and I'm a product management and leadership coach. I don't know how you feel, but I have many projects in my career that for some reason didn't went out as I wanted them to work actually. It was weird because for some reason many dependencies popped up, the scope increased and increased and increased. I had no idea when the feature will be finished. And a lot of people were asking me many questions that I wasn't able to answer. So I realized, okay, there is something that's going into the wrong direction. And there must be a way how you can avoid that. And the answer is very simple. With better planning, you can avoid a lot of uncertainty and a lot of open questions at the end. So as product manager back then, I was working for many companies. From little startup to medium-sized companies as well as hypergrowth companies. But there was one thing that all those companies had in common, a lack of planning. And therefore, I want to help you to better understand what are the relevant things and patterns you need to do in order to make sure that you have a good planned feature or product in place before you start developing. By the end of this course, you will be able to prepare a feature. You will be able to map out a user story map and defining the minimum viable product or minimum marketable feature, as well as further releases. And most important, pitching it to your stakeholders and to your engineering team, because that's most important for your success, getting the buy-in from your whole company. Additionally, I have added to this course a couple of PDFs, further reads, all the canvases that I'm using, as well as all the story maps, so that you can later on take a look and revisit everything that we have discussed. Next to that, I have created a user story mapping cheat sheet, which also contains further reads and links to podcast episode, articles and books in case you want to dive deeper into the whole topic. So with that said, I would say, let's get started. Let's take a look at the agenda. So at the beginning of this course, I would like to talk to you about the basics and the structure behind story mapping. So what is story mapping? What is the goal? When should you use it? And how do you prepare for a story mapping session or for a product planning in general? So the first 3 points will cover exactly the things that I have mentioned. And from that point on, we will go into the practical example that I have prepared. Actually 2 examples. So we will create 2 story maps together. And on top of that, there is also a little homework for you that you can do if you like to start playing around with user story mapping and start fostering what you have learned in this course. And right after that, after we have created our first story map, we will take a look on how to pitch those to my stakeholders as well as my engineering team. And once we have covered that, then we will do a small FAQ session where I quickly want to go through a couple of frequently asked questions that I hear many times as a product coach from my coachees or also companies that are asking these questions who are challenged with the creation process of user story mapping. So let's take a deep dive and jump right into it. So what is user story mapping? So generally, the idea was that user story mapping is a workshop-based thing. So that means you don't do it by yourself. So a workshop means more than one person, ideally, so at least 2. But it's always good to have a bigger group. So, and what you're gonna do is, with user story mapping, so you map out narrative user activities. So you try to understand what user activities can be for your future product or feature that you want to build. And the most important thing is it's very simple explained in natural language. So we're not doing any rocket science. We don't want to overblow it. We simply want to understand how our customers are going to use the product in simple explained language. And lastly, all these activities that our users very likely going to do will contain user stories, or I will also call it sometimes options. That's the same in the context of user story mapping. So these are the particular solutions that the user will use in order to be able to use the whole product, the whole process, and the whole function. And one question that I'm always getting asked is people saying, hey, Christian, couldn't I just create a story map by myself? So the answer is no and yes. So for sure you can do that. And if you are a one-man show or a one-woman show, for sure you can map out user flows if you like. But if you're working in a company with a team, I recommend always to involve more people, because the moment you have created your story map, you're going to show it to someone. And this person might have feedback. So you're going to discuss for an hour back and forth. You do brainstorming, you have additional ideas. The person challenges you maybe on what you have built. So you go back, you fix it, you show it again, then you show it to the next person. So you're going to create a lot of communication and a lot of meetings that are not necessarily most efficient. That's why I recommend to you always group up with a group of people that are relevant. But we will cover that in a few minutes. So what is the goal? The goal is obviously to define and identify how the user is going to flow through our product. And what we're going to do then is we're going to work out some solutions. So that doesn't necessarily mean that we only think about one solution, because user story mapping is a quite creative process. So we will come up with many solutions how the problem can be solved. And for sure, once we have all those options and all those solutions that eventually will solve our problem, we need to define a minimum viable product. You can also call it version 1. And next to that, version 1 is sometimes not enough, especially not for our stakeholders. They always want more, or our customers. So we can use the chance to create further releases and further versions with our user story map. And what are the benefits? I like calling it brain over muscle. So what we're going to do is we're going to plan before we develop. And I see many times people are very biased for action, so they just jump into building something without validating the idea or really understanding what they want to build. So the big benefit of user story mapping is that you first plan and then start developing. And while you are in this creation process of a user story map, you will identify a lot of dependencies and questions. Things that eventually would have popped up while you are developing. So it can prevent the unknowns that sometimes pop up. So that's why dependency management is also very important when it comes to user story mapping. And on top of that, the group that you're going to build to map out the user story map has the benefit of sharing a lot of knowledge and experience. So the more diverse your group is, the better, because you have a lot of different departments who bring in a lot of different expertises, and you're going to build this big picture of the future feature or product. And lastly, that's something that many people underestimate, is that we're going to develop a product documentation. So this is a status quo of a product, especially once it has been developed. New people who are joining the company or existing people can take a look and understand what you have built in which order. So just to wrap it up, the best time to do is the earlier the better, right? We want to do it before we start developing. And you should only do it once you have understood the problem that you want to solve, the problem of your customer, the problem of your business. And lastly, I'm not always a morning person, you should definitely do it after you had a very good cup of coffee. So overall, the basic idea of user story mapping is that we think about, okay, what kind of problem do we have? How do we want to solve it? Map this out in a very diverse group consisting of engineers, stakeholders, domain experts, designers, and then we define in which order we want to start developing the whole thing. With the benefit of knowing what kind of open questions we have, what kind of dependencies we have to eventually other teams or external stakeholders, and then just getting ready for doing it. So as a next point, let's take a look at the user story map structure. So I like looking at it from 3 different point of views. So the very first level of a user story map is obviously the user. The second level is the activities that the user is going to perform. And lastly, you have the user stories that will fall into those activities. The reason why I am a big fan of highlighting the user as the very first level is in complex products and in complex environments, you have usually more than one user who is going to perform certain actions. Let's take a simple example. Let's say we are an online shop and we want to build a return feature. So a customer can return a product. But for some reason, in those return process, the consumer has eventually to call customer support. And customer support has a back office functionality where they look into your order. So you see already that in the whole flow of this return process, there is more than one user involved because we have the customer as a user as well as the customer support agent. Therefore, I think it's always important to start with the user first and then go into those activities. But let's make a deep dive. So the user or persona is something that you define by yourself. Some people love working with personas, some hate it, that is up to you. You can have a persona who is called Business Sandra or Confused Carl, or you can just be very generic and say, okay, my user is the customer or my user is the buyer. So no rocket science behind that. But in case you're going to have well-defined personas, I would recommend using those. Because there's a reason why your product and design team has worked them out, and the more specific you are with your persona, the more specific your solution will be. So let's say in our example, the first user is just the consumer. So then we move on to the activities. A synonym for the activities is also the narrative flow. So these are real-world activities that are written in natural language. So let's say the user unlocks the iPhone and then opens the wallet app and then pays with credit card. So it's very simple and we don't want to blow it up. The main goal is to really explain what the person is going to do or the user. So very simple, very easy, very straightforward, no rocket science behind that. So, and just in case we would like to build a feature like Apple Pay. Let's assume Apple Pay doesn't exist yet. So we are working at Apple and we have the privilege to build and implement the Apple Pay feature. Yeah? And we would say, okay, we have our consumer. This consumer unlocks the phone, enters the wallet app, adds a new credit card, reads the intro text and continues, enters the credit card data, and so on and so on and so on. So I will not now go too deep into that example, but this would be one way of explaining the user activity. Simply explaining step by step what he or she is going to do. Right after that, we talk about the user stories or options. So I highlighted bold that activities can contain user stories. So for some activities, you don't have a user story. Let's say we would like to build a point of sale system for retailers. And our story map would start with the user goes into the store. The user picks up a t-shirt. So for picking up a t-shirt or going into the store, we very likely don't need a user story. So, but at some point when, for example, the user wants to pay with credit card, we're going to have some user stories that are relevant here. So that's why I just want to let you know, activities can contain user stories and they usually do, but they don't necessarily have to. And another thing is, once you're going to start adding user stories in the whole creation process, I always recommend to give them good titles. So a bad title could be, for example, if we would like to build the feature of Apple Pay, open phone. Open phone can mean everything, right? But if you would say the ability to unlock the phone on iOS 10 with a passcode is very specific. And the more specific you are, the less time or the less additional effort you will have later once you're going to translate these stories into your backlog. So let's take a deeper look here in this example. So the consumer unlocks the phone with the ability to unlock iOS 10 with a passcode. Let's assume the unlock via passcode function is not there yet. Then he or she enters the wallet app. So there is no user story because the wallet app exists already. and then adds a new card by pressing the Add Card button. There was no Add Card button before, so could be very likely a user story. That doesn't mean that you, for this little button, have only one story. So, for example, your engineers will later say, oh, we can move that into another story, or we need more stories because it's more complex and there's more backend involved. We don't know yet, but our team will tell us later what to do. So then the user is going to read, or the consumer is going to read the intro text and continues, and then enters the creditor card data by manually entering card data. So manually entering card data is maybe a better user story than just saying enter card data, because there are many ways how you can enter card data, right? So you can scan, you can manually type, you can import. So try to be as specific as possible when you are defining your user stories. It will later save you a lot of time. And you should also not forget, once you have created a story map and you're not looking at it for a couple of days, it's hard to remember if there's just one word or two words like unlocking phone. So therefore, I always recommend spend time in defining good user stories, because that's what it is about. And how do you read those? From top to bottom, from left to right, the iUser or the user unlocks the phone with the ability to unlock iOS 10 via passcode. After that, he or she enters the wallet app. Following, he or she adds a new card by pressing the Add Card button. This is how we're going to read story maps for ourselves, as well as when we are pitching a feature to someone else. And that's basically the whole idea of this 3 levels. So you have the user, you have the activities, and you have user story maps. So I know also that some people do not use the user or persona in first place. So they directly jump into activities and user stories, which is fine. You can do that as well. I think there is no hard definition on how you should do it. I think most important is that you figure out for yourself what works best for you. And again, if your product is not that complex, it's totally fine when you only have one user in your user story map. And then you don't necessarily need to add it on the first level. So you can then directly start with activities as well as the user stories. So I've mentioned at the beginning that it is very important to understand what kind of problem you want to solve for your customer, or what business goal you want to achieve. So therefore, I would like to spend the next couple of minutes to talk about the whole process of preparing a feature to make sure that you provide your team with as many information as possible. And next to that, it's also crucial to have a good session preparation up front, because once you're coming together in a bigger group of people, you want to work as efficient as possible. So, what to prepare up front? And I'm always saying you need to have a source of truth. This source of truth can be an epic or an opportunity canvas, a lean canvas. It can be a Confluence page, a Notion page, a Google Docs. Whatever it is, make sure you have something that you can share, ideally as a bundle, to a group of people. Something that contains important information such as a problem statement or a couple of hypotheses and business goals. Sometimes it's good to have business goals in place or hypotheses, because you can frame the solution. And then, and I hope it's clear for you, if not, I'm happy to emphasize on it again, the more data you have, the better. Without data, it's hard to make good decisions. So make sure that you're going to add as many data as possible that are relevant for your story mapping session to the feature. And lastly, if you are going to work with third parties or something like that, make sure that you're going to add further reads and additional information that people can look at upfront. So that helps them to better understand the complexity, and it helps them also to get familiar with the whole topic. Especially engineers. When they are coding all the time and they are asked to join a meeting, they don't necessarily have all the context in place. There's a lot of context switching that people do when they work, not only engineers, I mean everyone. So make sure that you're going to give people enough time to prepare up front to understand what the whole topic is about. And as part of this course, I have also added many PDF files that you can download with additional information and additional features that can help you to better structure yourself. And one of those things is this canvas. So I have created this canvas years ago and I like using it, and you can also adjust it. But what it covers is the title of the feature that we want to build first of all. Next to that, we have the problem statement as well as hypothesis that we need to add. And then we need to check out, okay, how does this fit into our current strategy? Does it increase revenue, or does it improve the user experiences? Do we make our processes better? Or does it promote more customer engagement? We don't know, but you need to figure out for yourself what's most important for your company at the moment. And then honestly, figuring out what personas or users are affected by this feature that you want to build. And then, we should ask a very important question. How do we measure success? And that's something that I see very rarely, that people think about success criteria that need to be hit in order to say, okay, this feature or this product was a successful thing. So really think about how you want to measure. And then in between, you can also define what kind of milestones you want to achieve. So is it just a one-time launch? Do we have multiple launches? Do we want to make it ready on staging first to extensively test it? Or does it go directly to production? So there are many things that you can consider as a milestone, and it makes sense to think about those things upfront. And then the urgency, as always. Is it low? Is it high? Is it medium? Usually it's always urgent, but you should think about it. And then something you can do if you are working closely with senior engineers or tech leads is to think about a project size. So that doesn't mean that you're going to commit to it. And it's nothing that you should as a product manager by yourself. So make sure you grab a person who has enough knowledge and understanding to roughly estimate the project size. And once those things are in place, you have something that you can pitch to a group and explain them what kind of problem you want to solve and how you eventually could solve it. And that brings us to the question, who should join a user story mapping session? And as I said at the beginning, it's something you shouldn't do by yourself, so at least 2 people, but I would also recommend to have no more than 8 people, because if you have too many people, you will end up in too many discussions. So big companies like Facebook or Google or Amazon have shown that smaller groups are usually the most efficient ones. So make sure that you do not be more than 8 people. And people who are participating should be obviously product people, product managers, product designers. It's always good to have 1 or 2 senior engineers or sometimes junior engineers, however you work in your company, or an architect, and for sure domain experts who can answer your questions in case you need them. If not, I would leave them out. So, and then you are going to have this session, and these days it's maybe a little bit harder to do it on-site. However, if you have an on-site session, make sure that you have a room booked with a free white wall or a whiteboard, or let's say a big window where you can use the glass to put on your sticky notes. You should prepare sticky notes in different colors as well as pens. And lastly, as I mentioned before, prepare the feature that you would like to work on. So these things must be in place for a good user story mapping session. If you're going to do it remote, you should have added the remote tool to your invitation. I'm a big fan of Avignon.io, or alternatively, you can also use Miro or simply Google Spreadsheets, but tools is a topic that we discuss later. So, and then something that I'm praising a lot as a coach is no meeting should happen without an agenda. So define a note taker should be the first thing on your agenda, because there are many things that you're going to discuss, and it's good to have someone who takes care of those. And then right after that, you are going to pitch your feature, which can take up to 10 to 15 minutes, that depends. And that should also involve a couple of questions that people should ask you and that you can answer. And once you are done with the Q&A session and feature pitch, then you jump right into the story mapping creation process. So, and this can take between 60 minutes and 90 minutes, 30 minutes. I can't tell you the exact time, but you should block at least an hour for the story mapping session. And why is something that you're going to see in a few minutes. And then lastly, before you're going to end the session, no matter what, make sure that you define follow-ups. Because there are always open questions, there are always further things that need to be taken care of, and it's important to nail those down, create action items, and also assign owners. So, in a nutshell, make sure that you have prepared a source of truth which contains all relevant information of the product or feature that you want to build. And once you have that, make sure that you're going to invite the right people at the right time with an agenda to make sure that you can start as structured and as efficient as possible. Before we start with the story mapping creation process, we first of all have to pitch to the user story mapping group what we're going to build. And therefore, I would start with a simple canvas or an epic that I would pitch to the group of people. And I have spoiled you already a little bit. The feature we want to build is Apple Pay. So the scenario we are right now in is that we are employees at Apple. We have identified a customer problem, and we believe that the solution would be to enable our customers to pay contactless via credit card with an NFC device via Apple Pay. And what I would do now is, as a product manager or the responsible person who's going to drive the feature, would be pitching the whole canvas. And the first thing is obviously the problem statement. So I would tell the people that we have observed that people have many cards, cash, coins in their pockets. And the whole payment experience on counters, in markets and shops is very painful and slow because people need to search and find a card or cash and then get exchange, etc. Therefore, our hypothesis is that we believe that the ability to add any credit card to your phone and being able to pay via NFC without any PIN, without any signature or any kind of code will make the whole payment experiences for customers and retailers much more joyful. And looking at our internal values and strategy at Apple, it would increase our revenue, it would improve the user experience, it would make processes faster, and it promotes also customer engagement. Therefore, it has a high strategic fit. And the affected persona would be obviously our users, which is the consumer. And the way we would measure success would be the number of cards that have been added, which would be a leading indicator. So just to tell you the difference between leading and lagging indicators or KPIs or metrics or however you call it, is the following. A leading indicator is something that tells you if you are on track. So it has like this future outlook. The number of transactions via Apple Pay is a lagging indicator. So that shows us what has happened. And therefore, it's always important to have both of them because one will tell you if you are heading into the right direction and the other one will tell you later if you did or not. And then we have some milestones. So the first milestone is that we make Apple only available on iPhone 6 or the latest devices, because back then iPhone 6 was the latest one. And then as a next step, it will be launched on iOS 8.1. And another milestone would be to roll it out to all compatible devices. It is very urgent because it has a high strategic fit and the estimated project size is quite big, it's large. So the business canvas that I have shown to you here is one example. But we could go one level deeper in case we have had more time to prepare the feature. And this is what I'm going to show you next in the epic. Another way to explain what we want to build to our team would be an epic. So let's say we have already created a Jira ticket in form of an epic and we have filled it out. We could also use that to pitch it to the team because we are a big fan of using Jira and having one source of truth. So we have the same problem statement as I just mentioned before, as well as the same hypothesis that we would pitch to the group. But then we would go a little bit more in depth. So we would have already more success criteria defined. We, for example, know that a third-party payment API has been implemented from, let's say, American Express US. Apple Pay will be launched on 8.1.1. It will be launched US only, so that's a clear success criteria and also scope. The first phone that will be supported with Apple Pay will be iPhone 6 and 6 Plus. Other devices can be activated without an OS update later. It's definitely one of the success criteria we are aiming for. Then monitoring and tracking has been implemented, and the rollout and marketing campaigns have been prepared with marketing. So it involves also some product work here. The measuring of success is a little bit more in detail. So we could, for example, say that technically we don't want to have more than 0.5% failed transactions due to technical errors. For sure, card payments can also fail because you have not enough balance on your card or it's not accepted. So we would like to focus on our own responsibility, which would be the technical part, and therefore we say not more than 0.5%. And then when it comes to the adoption, we could say, okay, if we look at the user experience here, we could say finishing the add credit card process should be more than 90% for supported banks. So let's say we support American Express as the first bank. Then people who are going to start the adding card process on the iPhone, more than 90% would finish it. And then the lagging indicator would be then overall the number of cards that have been added. We could also be more specific and say number of cards that have been added from the people who have been started, right? Because that would give us a broader or more detailed range as well. And what we need to analyze later on, because we have a great idea, we have done some market research, but we still want to learn from what we have built, from our MVP, we could say, okay, to be analyzed are data that, for example, would include the average transaction volume per user on daily basis, weekly basis, monthly basis, etc. We could do it by user group, so based on the age, the region, the country. So I'm pretty sure that Apple has many criteria here, but I just want to give you a glance of how you could define an epic on a very higher level. And then open questions would be, or open things that we need to do, could be, for example, define a clear test plan together with the QA team, or defining monitoring for services which needs to be done by the engineers. And out of scope would be, for example, countries outside the US, because we're going to start with US only. And even here, as you know, or what I'm doing here is I was pitching that to you now for about 3 minutes. Moving on, I would ask the people for feedback. So what do you think about that? Is there something that we have missed? What do you believe is relevant to be successful with the first version, and so on. So now you should have an open conversation with your team and also involve and include the different point of views from the different people, like the engineers, the stakeholders, designers, to have a fruitful conversation. But you also need to be aware of the fact that you don't do epic planning here or feature planning. It's more like making sure that we are all on the same page and then getting started. So everything that cannot be clarified or answered should be added to the meeting notes, and then you can move on. And in case there are too many open questions which don't allow you to move on, you need to take a break. You need to stop the session, go back and do your homework. And many people try to force it, and I recommend don't do that, because you need to have some basic information or the basics clarified before you start thinking about a solution. So once we are set with that, it's time to start creating the story map. Now it's time to start working on the story map. So whether you are remote or on-site, this is now the time where you are going to think about solutions based on the problems your customer have. And after you have pitched the feature and have answered questions, it's about starting what's going to happen and how the feature will be used by our future customer or existing customer. So based on the pitch I have given you already, we will focus mainly on the consumer. And from that point on, we need to define now the activities as well as the user stories based on the activities. So let's take a look at how to approach now the story mapping. We know that we have the 3 different levels, and we're going to create a story map always from left to right. with some exceptions, sometimes you can also start at the end of the story map, but this is something I'm going to show you in the next example. So for this one, we're going to do it in a very basic way and start from left to right. So we want to build Apple Pay. So what's the first thing that our customer is going to do when he or she is going to use the new feature? So could it be creating a card? Could it be opening the app? Could it be receiving a push notification that tells me that there is something new? So there might be many ways, but let's start very simple. So the very first thing the customer does, we will assume, will be opening or unlocking the phone. And that would be the first card that we would going to add. So either in the remote tool or on a physical sticky note, and we just stick it there and continue brainstorming. So what's going to happen next? Due to the fact that we also have designers in our group and compliance specialists, etc., the designers might say, hey, where should we create a new credit card? And then we would start discussing and identifying that we want to have one source of truth where we are adding our important information and documents. Well, what could be better than the wallet app? Great. So let's use the wallet app. And the next thing the customer does is, after unlocking the phone, he or she will enter the wallet app. So that would be the next one that we would add. And very important here is we just focus on activities. Before we talk about user stories, we need to make sure that we have the narrative flow roughly defined. And you shouldn't be afraid of changing it, because the longer you sit together and the more you discuss, the more often you're going to change it. That's a normal thing. So it happens quite often that you switch the cards, remove them, add new ones. That's totally fair. And this is also one of the reasons why you can't do a user story mapping session in 30 minutes. Maybe you need some more sessions for an hour or longer, and that's totally fine. So going back to the user flow, we have unlocked the phone as a customer, we have opened the wallet app. So what are we going to do next? And you would say, okay, we would very likely add a new credit card. So, okay, let's add that. What happens right after that? We should start entering the credit card data. Good point. And then someone from the compliance team might say, hey, we need to enter the credit card data, but we also have to read the instruction text to know what's going on and give some legal background to the customers that they know what they are going to do. It's also a very good point. So that would happen next. And then the designers might say, yeah, that's all good. We don't like adding that, but we have to. And the compliance team will say, yeah, due to legal reasons, we have to first let them read the instruction and then let them enter the credit card data. And now you would have a discussion, because your design team will say, it's a better user experience to first add the data and then accept the terms and conditions, or let's say read the instruction. Because once you have done that, it's more likely that you're going to continue the flow, because it could be a blocker to directly start with a long text that you have to accept. However, the compliance team might say, we have to do that, so let's switch that. So, and you see already that would be the first time where we would identify a change in the flow and we just have changed it. No problem with that. And very important, so we are talking just about the flow. How the user interface will look like later is a complete different topic. So that's what the designers have to work out. So after we have entered the credit card, what are we going to do next? So after long discussions and back and forth, we realized that we have to press the done button to finish the whole process. Great. So you will see some space here. The reason why I have added the space, you will see in a couple of minutes. So you can also put them all next to each other, no problem, but you will understand in a couple of minutes why. So and right after pressing the done button, we have to accept the terms and conditions of the Apple Pay usage. So first, we've got an introduction text, and now we have to do the legal stuff. And there is no way around. So we have accepted the terms and conditions, and with that, the card has been added to our wallet. So we could say, okay, great, that's it. And theoretically, it would be if the whole feature would be based around adding a credit card. But in our case here, we want also to do a checkout. So the next thing would be initiating a card payment with the phone. So we could add another sticky saying initiate a transaction. So, and once I have initiated the transaction, as you maybe know, you're going to put your phone on a card reader in order to connect it with the NFC and making the transaction happen. So, and then we need to ask ourselves, okay, is that everything? After that, the payment will either go through or not, and then we would be done. So, but now we could argue, okay, from a user perspective, is that the only thing I want to do? Because I have now spent some money and I want to know what's going on with my money and my credit card. So we could say, okay, the customer need to open the wallet app again in order to see the transaction history. So let me remove the block here, and you would say, okay, I enter the wallet again and then select the credit card to review my previous transactions. Because you want to have full transparency on what is going on, and our customers deserve to see that. So that would be, first of all, a basic flow. And for sure, if you are going to do it with your group, it will take longer because you have much more discussions and you have not a prepared feature like I have right now. But what I want to show you here is the creation process. So there are a couple of questions that you need to ask yourself. You're going to change your mind sometimes. Sometimes you don't have answers to questions that you need to follow up on. For example, the read introduction, as well as entering the credit card data, it's something that you maybe change later. After you go back and forth with the compliance team and the legal team, you have identified that the instruction text has to come first. Maybe you're not doing this in the first session, but that's fine. So, long story short, make sure that you first of all focus on what the user will do. And again, here is no rocket science, here is no technical stuff involved. It's just simply step by step what the consumer will do with the phone and how he or she is adding a credit card and making a transaction. So with that said, we have first of all the basic flow. Let's continue with the user stories. So now we do have the flow, and now it's important to think about how we can solve the issues and how they will look like later in our product or in our feature. So the very first thing would be unlocking the phone. And how can you unlock a phone? You could, for example, say by using a passcode, or by using no passcode, or by using Face ID. So we could start adding those sticky notes to visualize how you can unlock the phone. But I need to tell you here, due to the fact that the iPhone exists already since a longer time, this feature would be already existing. So you can add existing functionality to a user story map, but you don't have to. So I did it here right now to just show it to you, but you don't need to do it because it's very likely that these sticky notes here would refer to another story map, right? Because once the iPhone has been, well, back then when the iPhone was built the first time, it was very likely that way that they have also thought about the feature of unlocking the phone already back then. So as a next step, the user would open the wallet app. So the wallet app itself could be a whole story map, but we assume now it's there already, or it is there already, and therefore we don't mention it and don't add any user story. But within that wallet app, we would need to add the function to add a credit card. So we could say, okay, the consumer would add a credit card by pressing the add card button. So somewhere we would need to add this new button. And how this user story will look like in detail later is something that's going to happen after you have pitched it to your team, then in the backlog groomings together with your designer who is going to work out the user interface. So as a next step, I have to read the instruction and continue. So and the introduction text has to be in all languages. As you know, the iPhone is a multi-language device, so we would need to make sure that we have translation in place. So we could add a user story by clicking the OK button on the screen in all languages. So it would refer to the fact that we would have one screen that explains what's going to happen in the next steps in all languages. So we wouldn't very likely not hard code, or maybe we would. I don't know how it works at Apple and with the iPhone. However, we would need to think about that. And therefore we need to add a user story. And whether this will be a big user story or a small, or needs to be broken down in multiple user stories, that's something that's right now none of our business. This will be discussed later with the engineering team in depth. So then I have to enter credit card data. How can I do that? So I can do it the classic way by just entering my credit card data manually by typing it into forms. But since we're Apple, we have maybe higher standards, and we would say, okay, I could also import data from an existing wallet that I have on my phone. Or alternatively, I could scan my credit card. But if I scan my credit card, I still have to enter the security code manually. So how would we visualize that? And I told you a couple of minutes before that here's a space, and now you're going to see why. So you see, the first way of entering a credit card is by manually entering the data in the form. So that would be a simple form field that we would code in. The other way would be the import function, or we could have the scanning credit card function. But the scanning credit card function has an additional step. So the first step is scanning the card, and the second step is then manually entering the security code. And the reason why I left some space here is because if user stories are building up on each other, or have also certain steps that are followed, you can visualize like that in the user story map. If you don't want to, you can also just enter it below. So we have now a couple of ideas how we could build that feature. And later on, we will take that blue line and discuss what should be part of the MVP and what not. We come to this in a couple of seconds. However, as a next step, I need to press the done button to finish the process. So while I'm going to do that, we have some back-end work happening because I have entered some credit card data, but they need to be evaluated against something, right? So we need to make sure that the credit card data are getting checked with the related bank to make sure that someone has a valid credit card. So there is some back-end magic happening. We don't know exactly how it will look like technically, and we don't have to, because the goal of a user story map is to focus on the consumer behavior first. The technical solution will be worked out later by the engineers. So the engineers will appreciate the fact that you have added the story, because it's for them a good reminder to think about the technical architecture and the technical process behind. So as a next step, I have to accept the terms and conditions, and this is by going to a screen and simply pressing accepting those. Alternatively, we could also cancel, for sure. And then we want to initiate our first transaction. And if you know, there are two ways how you can use Apple Pay. So one is by pressing 2 times the on-off screen, or alternatively, you can manually go into your wallet app and select the card and enter the passcode. So again, we would have 2 ways of making this feature work. And even here, we would have a follow-up, because once we're going to press 2 times the code, we would need to enter our passcode. Back then, it was also the fingerprint that you were able to put down there, so that would be also another option. So then we have to hold the phone on an NFC compatible device, which means we're going to charge the credit card. And we also make sure that we show whether the transaction was successful or not. So we have like a success or failed screen that comes first. And after that, or while that's happening, we're going to charge the credit card in the background. So we could also do it the other way around and first of all charge and then show the transaction was successful or not. Because in case it didn't work or it worked, we will just be able to show the screen based on the result. And then I enter the wallet app. And lastly, I check my transaction history. And that's something that's very important, because we would need to show a couple of transactions that have been done. We are not the bank account, so that means we don't show you all the transactions that are going on, especially when they weren't made with Apple Pay. But we should at least show them the transactions that have been done with the Apple Pay feature. And how many transactions we show, for which time frame, these things need to be worked out separately. So that was now the basic foundation of the story map. So we have looked at the first level, which is the consumer. We defined the activities, and now we have mapped out a couple of solutions how the feature could work later. So the question would be now, what will be our MVP? And the MVP discussion is one that can be very big and very long. So how do you approach it? And something that I have learned which really blew my mind away was, what you can do is you can just copy this story map here and create multiple versions. But what we're going to do first is, we first of all decide what will be the minimum viable product or the minimum marketable feature that we're going to build. So since we are having this functionality already, I'm going to remove the existing functions. And we could ask ourselves now, okay, if we just want to make that feature simply work, we don't need the ability to import credit card data or to scan it. That's a nice to have. But we could go very, very basic and say, okay, the only thing we want to get started is the ability to add it manually. And everything else is kind of required, so we cannot scope out anything else apart from the fact that we start a transaction without, for example, pressing 2 times the on-off button. That could be also something we leave out. We could say, okay, we just go directly into the app. The user experience wouldn't be the most beautiful one, but it would work. So that would be one way of building Apple Pay. So we could say, okay, we move that blue line up, and this is now our MVP. That's the first version we're going to build. It's the bare minimum. And we could say, okay, as a next release, we want to have the import function. That's super crucial and very requested by a lot of customers. Plus, on top of that, we want also to add the functionality to double click. Good. That would be the next version. So we can just copy paste that blue line and create another version here, another version or another release. So we would have the MVP on top, the second release and the third release. And with that, you would have already planned the feature. For sure, you need to align this now with your stakeholders and pitch it to them, and we come to that. But what you could also do is you could just copy paste that one here, and we can say, okay, let's create an alternative version for our stakeholders or for our VP product or whomever, and show them, okay, the one that we have just built is the bare minimum. But due to the fact that we have higher standards, we want to directly start with all the features except the scanning part. We could also copy paste again and say, all right, the very first version is simply everything. We build all features on one. So the cool thing is now you can go to your stakeholders and show these different versions to them. And that shows also how much you think about the product. So you offer a bare minimum, you offer a version that is maybe best to go to market, you offer a version that is maybe has the best user experience. So you can look at different ways, on different angles, on the consumer side, on the business side, on the market side, and create different versions of the story map. And that's what makes it so powerful. Because the more versions you have, the better you can discuss with your stakeholders, with the upper management, and make the right strategic choices. And that was something that I have learned from the founders of Avion.io, the guys who also invented a user story mapping tool. They shared this way of just copy pasting the story map with me in a podcast episode, and I was blown away. And I just asked myself, after many years of story mapping, why did I never had the idea of just copy pasting a story map and creating multiple versions? So going back to our original example, we can do release planning, we can do version planning, we have now defined a minimum viable product, and this is what user story mapping is about. So what we did in this story map now was very basic. So the basic user consumer flow. But there is a way to go a level deeper, which I'm going to show you next. One more thing to add before we continue is about the user stories. So what you can see here is we have just added simply titles, right? So there is no acceptance criteria in them. There are no details, no scope, and that's totally fine. The basic idea is to first of all roughly understand what we want to build. In case you have already some acceptance criteria in your mind or some edge cases that you need to think about, nothing should stop you from creating a new sticky note in whatever kind of color and add those additional information and just adding them next to the ticket so that you don't forget about it. So the basic idea is that we first of all focus on the frame, on the rough overview of features you want to build, and then sit down as a team and work out the solutions together. The more information you have upfront, the better it is. And sometimes you have a ticket that might be very complex and you have technical dependencies or services that need to be refactored. If you identify such things during a story mapping session, feel free to add it to the ticket description or in the form of an extra sticky note as I did it here, because then you can add it later easily to your backlog. So what you can see now is almost the same story map, and don't get confused by the different colors and by the different errors. I'm going to tell you now what I have done and what makes it a little bit more detailed than the previous version. So what you can see here is the flow is almost the same. The only thing that has changed is the part in the middle. So you remember in the happy path, when we press the done button, we're going to check the credit card. And after that, we're going to accept the terms and conditions. But what's going to happen in case the data are not correct? Or what happens if the card gets rejected? So what we're going to take a look at now is the edge cases. And the edge cases should be part of a story map as well. So after I have pressed the done button and we're going to check the data, it could happen that some data are maybe not correct. So what we would do here is we would show an error message and explain what went wrong. And then we would move the user to the end credit card screen because I have to correct my data. The other scenario could be the card gets rejected. For some reason, it's blocked, it's not working, it has no balance, whatever kind of reason it has, we're going to do the same thing again. We're going to show an error message and tell the user what went wrong and bring him or her back to the add new card screen, because they need to add a new card. It doesn't work like that. You cannot correct anything anymore. And after that, in case everything went well or I have corrected my data, I will go back to the happy path again and continue with the terms and conditions. So what we have added here is an additional step that shows the edge cases. And it's always good to highlight the edge cases in a user story map as well. From a user perspective, as well as from a technical point of view, we will not forget that there is something that we need to think about. And this is when the flow breaks or not works as it should be. And every product has that usually. And the reason why I added the errors is also to visualize where the user is going to after he or she has, for example, a rejected card. So you see that we already are moving more into the direction of, edge cases and also dependencies. So because we know once we have something to correct or a flow has to stop, we need to reinitiate certain processes from a user perspective and also from a technical perspective. And again, we're not going into depth now, but that's what we later will do once we're going to refine and groom the user stories. As Apple likes saying, there's one more thing. Or to be more specific, there's one more way to create a story map. And the common question that people ask is, can I create a technical story map as well? And the answer to that is simply no. It is a user story map and you should focus on the user. However, if you want to do it in a more advanced way, you can start thinking about system personas to explain business logic and processes behind it. But I want to tell you, that's a very advanced way of doing user story mapping. And I recommend you not doing it, first of all, in the first sessions you're going to do. And secondly, never do it by yourself. Always let that do by the engineers or by the technical people. However, let's assume we are working at Apple and our operating system is based on SDKs. So that's something that is given. Okay, that's not something that we are making up right now. So then we could explain or visualize the logic that is going to happen after the user presses the done button by saying, okay, one system persona could be the payment SDK that then will send the data of the card to the payment backend. our own payment backend. That backend would then receive data, validate data, and send them afterwards to the PSP. The PSP is a payment service provider. And after that, the payment service provider would receive and confirm the data in case everything goes well, and send the data back to our payment backend. And we could eventually say, okay, the payment backend would then again communicate to our payment SDK. But the question is, do you really need to go that deep? You can do it, and sometimes it's helpful and valuable to explain the logic and the processes that are happening behind the scenes, but it's something that you don't have to do. But I wanted to show you the option, because sometimes it can be helpful to spend a little bit more time on what is going on behind the scenes and how could it look like. And also for a product person, it can be very helpful to better understand how the processes work. But it's not a given. I just wanted to present you the option of doing so. And the last thing that I would like to share with you is, you have maybe seen that I have added numbers to each activity. And I want to tell you simply why I did that. The longer a story map gets, the harder it is to remember which point you are talking about, especially when you pitch the story map to someone else. So instead of remembering the sentence or the half sentence that you have written here, like sends data to the payment backend, you're just getting the pitch from someone and you say, okay, I have a question 2.7 or 2.4 or 2.9, whatever you have picked up. So that's why I would always recommend adding the numbers once you are, let's say, 90% sure that you're not going to change the activity flow again. So with that, we're going to jump to the next example, and we will take now a look on how to create a story map from the end and not from the beginning. Let's take a look at another example. Before we start creating the story map from right to left, I want to quickly explain to you what this whole feature is about and what we are doing. And there is a story map that I have created already, first of all, that will be the foundation for the upcoming feature that we're going to map out together. And the reason why I just want to spend some time explaining it to you is we have later on also a chapter which is called Pitching Story Maps. And I'll do it already a little bit in the way of how I would pitch a story map once I have created one, so that you start getting the notion of how to do that. And what are we talking about? So what we're talking about here is an online shop that we are having. So let's say we are a smaller company, we are not Amazon or Subboss or any kind of big company. And we have our own online shop and we are selling gold and silver coins. That's what we are doing. And we have one important decision made back then, which is we just want to work with one third-party logistics provider. So that means one carrier who is going to ship the products to the customers. So apart from that, we have a very basic online shop, nothing fancy, and we are selling those things online. And I want to just quickly pitch you what's going on, who the user is, and how the activities are looking like. So our consumer is the shopping Sandra, and the way she's going to explore the product is by, first of all, finding a product on our website, then inspecting it and looking into the details. There is an optional flow that she can add the product to the wish list. However, usually she adds the product to the cart. Then she signs up to our online shop and to the checkout. Then she selects the shipping method, reviews and pays. She receives the confirmation notification, and then she receives the product. This is what this flow is about. But to follow up on it, she also wants to return a product. And for the whole return process, we need to create a story map, which is going to happen in a couple of minutes. But next to that, I would ask you now, what do you think about it? Do you have any questions? And I would start discussing with you as my stakeholder now, whether you like it, whether there are open questions, and we would have an interactive conversation about it. And once that is clear, I would go with you into each activity and discuss each of the user stories. So we will not do this in depth now, because I think it's most important that you understand what this flow is and what this example is about. And then we have the foundation to map out the return process. But you can see here already finding product can happen by browsing through categories or by typing in something into a search field. And then by looking at the images on the product detail page and looking at the description and so on and so on and so on. What's important here is to know that once I'm going to select a shipping method, there's only DHL. As I told you, that's the only carrier we are working with, the third-party logistics provider. For upcoming releases, we have already planned integrating, for example, UPS, which haven't happened yet, or picking up stuff in the store directly, but we don't have a store yet, so it's something for the future. However, what we know is that we need to provide the function for Sandra to return a product. So let's assume you have bought one silver coin and one gold coin and you want to return because you don't like them or you don't believe anymore in gold and silver. We need to make that happen. And with that, we're going to jump now into the creation of this new story map from the end and not from the beginning. We want to build a return feature to help our customers returning our products. Obviously, we are never happy when something gets returned. However, as a good online shop, we have to provide this ability. The only issue we have is we are not Amazon and we don't have this huge e-commerce online shop experience as any other big players have. So we kind of need to reinvent the wheel or at least start with the very basics because we have never done it before. In order to make sure that we think end to end and don't miss any important step in the process, we decided to start at the end of the process. This is one way that you can do if you don't know exactly how this whole process will look like. It can be recommended if you want to be a little bit more creative. And I also need to let you know that it requires much more brain power. However, sometimes best ideas are born if you start at the end. And I recommend you trying it out at least one time. But before we start mapping out the story map, let's take a look at the scope of the feature. Because there are some constraints and some limitations that we have decided on upfront that we're not going to do or that we have to do. So very important is we only enable our customers to return the whole feature. Why is that? It's a shitty experience, but we only have 5% of our customers who are generally returning products. So that's why we said, okay, let's start with the shitty version. They have to send back everything and we give them a full refund. Later on, we're going to build a different feature, but for now, we only do full refunds. No partial returns, no partial refunds. Next to that, the shipping costs have to be paid by the customer. So maybe in America or in the US, that's fine. In Germany, it's not. But let's go with that way that the customer will not receive the full return. The shipping costs get deducted from the refunded amount. The return label needs to be requested by the customer, and the refund will be only to the original payment method. So if you pay with credit card, we're going to refund you the money on the credit card, not onto your bank account, not on PayPal, only on the initial payment method. And as you know, only 5% of our customers are going to return the products anyway. So we have nothing when it comes to processes at the moment, so we need to think about how we can solve that issue. So let's take a look. What would be the very last thing the customer would do? Or someone else, maybe more users and personas are involved into that flow. So after discussion and going back and forth, we agreed upon the fact that the very last thing that's going to happen is that the customer, or shopping Sandra in our case, is going to receive the refunded amount. So let's take a look at it. So we have Sandra who receives the money. What could happen before she receives the money? It's tough, right? Is there someone who's going to approve the refund? Is there a call that she's going to receive to answer some questions? So we could argue now for a longer time, but one thing that must happen is that she receives a confirmation that she will receive the refund. So therefore, we could say, okay, another step that happens before is that she receives a confirmation email, for example. Or we could also just say, a confirmation notification and then decide in form of a user story if it either will be email or a call or a letter or something like that. The reason why I'm sharing that with you right now is also that you understand activities shouldn't be too specific. The less specific they are, the more you can interpret later into the user stories. So what happens before that? There must be someone who's going to approve that return and with that the refund. So who is that? So we have someone who is working in our distribution center or warehouse who is called Distribution Alex. And he will be the person who is approving the returned product. So what is Alex doing beforehand? Before that, he must have checked the product, right? In order to evaluate if he's going to accept the coins or not, because maybe they are broken or she sent different coins that we have never sold to her. Could have happened. So therefore, there is this process of reviewing and checking the returned product or products. So let's move that back. And what happens before that? Before that, someone, let's say Alex, must have received the return products. So, and you see already, we are trying to go from the very end to the very beginning and try to make sure that we cover all relevant steps. So what must have happened before Alex has received the return product? Yeah, obviously Sandra needs to have shipped it to him, right? So therefore we could say, okay, Shopping Sandra sends the products to the distribution center. DC stands for distribution center or warehouse or whatever. What happened before that? So before I ship something, I need to add a label on it or something on the parcel to make sure that the carrier, like DHL, will accept it. What happened before that? So before I'm going to add the labels, as we know, they have to be requested. And once I have them requested, I will receive them. So we can obviously derive out of that they have to be received. And before that, they have to be requested, kind of. So, but let's first of all take a look at the receiving part. So Sandra has now received the return slip and label. Or we can say, let's remove the slip. It's just the label to not make it too complicated. So Sandra receives the return label, puts the return label on the parcel, sends the product to the DC. Then our new persona or user, Alex from the distribution center, receives the return product, reviews it and checks it, approves it, and with that Sandra would receive a confirmation email and then receive the money. So Sandra has received the return label, but before that she has requested it. So how can she request it? Well, we have a customer support department. And you know what? She called that. So we know that there is an interaction required with our support center. So therefore, there is another persona coming into place. The reason why we're making this complex example is also to show you how you can work with multiple users and personas. So there is this persona of Carlos Supportos, who is going to send the papers to Sandra. And before that, he must have identified her somehow and must have looked her up in the data and make sure that she receives the return labels and makes sure to identify how she wants to receive those. So we could either say, okay, I want this via an email, or I want you to send them to me via a letter. And before that, Carlos needs to find her in the system, as well as initiating the return process. So let's take a look again. Carlos looks up Sandra's order, initiates the return, asks how she wants to receive the papers, and now we're coming to what I said at the beginning with the confirmation email. So now you could say, okay, how would you like to receive those? And then we could say, okay, either via email or via a letter or via another way. So I don't know what kind of features exist out there, but you can add each of those into a user story. But what happens before that? Well, we identified that Sandra contacted Carlos via phone. So Carlos did need to pick up the phone, and obviously Sandra did the same by calling him. So she picked up the phone and called him, and he picks up the phone and receives the call. So this is just one way of looking at the whole return process. And obviously we picked a very complex one here, but I did that on purpose to show you a little bit how you work with different personas. And obviously we have also created some user stories. I will not go too deep into them, but just to give you a brief understanding. So if Sandra looks up the order, somehow Carlos must be able to search and find the number in an e-com back office system, whether it's one from Shopify or one that we're going to program by ourselves. There is something that needs to happen. So if we're going to build it by ourselves, we definitely have a user story here. In case not, then he would just make use of the existing functionality from a solution like Shopify. And once he's going to ask her how she wants to receive the papers, we could say, okay, by selecting the email, by selecting the address to send a letter, by entering a new email address, or by entering a new address to send the letter to with the return label. So there are many ways how you can execute this activity at the end of the day. And then he will press send, and then she will receive either via email or physically the return label. And for distribution Alex, who's working in the whole distribution center, in this big distribution center, he must also work with a warehouse management system, where he's going to add, at the end of the day, once the coins have been approved by him, back to the stock. And once I'm going to add it back to the stock, it also needs to be updated in the online shop, right? And also he needs to initiate the refund. And that eventually triggers sending an email confirmation. And you can already see that these two topics might be connected, and your engineers say, okay, we can do this in one user story. Or they might say, oh, that's such a biggie. We have to create a complete new architecture, a new microservice or microservices who are connected to each other and triggering different actions within the whole process. So that's something that we don't know. But as I told you, in case there are some additional information that we are aware of, we could say, okay, let's create a sticky note and say, check with the infrastructure team about setting up new services. Could be one thing that might be relevant for us to remind ourselves. So we could just add that to the initiate refund. And I could go on for hours. I don't want to make it too complex, but this is a way how you start from the end and go back to the beginning. It can sometimes help you a lot to stay more focused and to be more detail oriented, but it can be also sometimes much more work, but it doesn't have to. So you need to figure out for yourself how much you know about the feature and how much you know about the processes. If you think it's straightforward, you can start at the beginning. If you want to experiment a little bit or want to be more creative, it sometimes helps to start at the end. And that was creating a return feature from the end. However, we just talked about a full order return. What about returning a product partially? And this is some homework for you. I want you to think about a process, how you would create it based on the fact that we have a partial return, a partial refund, and the shipping costs are getting carried by us. So I don't have the answer. I don't have a complete story map that I will share with you, but I want you to think about it, because what makes user story mapping so great is that everyone, every company, every team comes up with their own solutions. And this is what it is about. It's about being creative and thinking about what's best for our customers, not for customers from other companies. We're doing our own thing in the most efficient and most effective way. Have fun with it and let me know what your outcomes were. So now we have learned how to create a story map, or a couple of story maps actually. And now what's the next step? It's very important as a product manager to master pitching the story map to your stakeholders and especially to your engineering team. And upcoming, I would like to take a deeper look on the best ways on how to pitch a story map to your stakeholders as well as your team. To make it a little bit easier, I will start with the stakeholders. And I told you already, once you have created one or a couple of story maps, you have a good foundation to have very great strategic discussions with the upper management and talk about what's best for your consumers as well as the company. However, I would like to emphasize on not having too many people in such a meeting. You need to bear in mind, everyone wants to be a creative mind, everyone wants to be a product manager, a product developer, and someone who builds great products. So that means you usually receive a lot of feedback in such sessions. Therefore, limit it to maximum 8 people. And I know it sounds weird, but there are always people who want to have a stake into it. You can share it afterwards to them, but in that pitch, make sure the most relevant and influential people are part of that. And also make sure that you are not the only person on the front. So bring someone who's going to support you from a product perspective and who can eventually take notes and write down open questions. So invite the most important people, define a note taker at the beginning or someone who supports you, and then you're going to pitch the feature and the epic like I did, or the canvas, that everyone knows what we're talking about. And if everyone knows it, for sure you can skip that part or make it shorter, but it's always good at the beginning of the meeting to catch up with what's going on. And right after that, you start with the user and the activity stream. So make sure that you're going to hide the user stories, as I did, and only present them the activities. And ideally, they have already numbers to make it easier for your audience, and then you pitch the flow. And what's very important is in between to make short breaks and ask if someone has a question. In case of our Apple Pay example, I would say it's short enough to completely pitch it. If your story map is longer, you should make some breaks in between. I recommend taking a break before you're going to talk about different edge cases, or if in case there is a new persona coming into place, you can also make a break and ask, hey, does anyone has any questions? And people sometimes ask how you expect this flow to work in real life, or they have maybe some other ideas, or they give you some feedback about things that you have already covered in the user stories. So make sure that you bring everyone on the same page and up to speed, and don't lose them while you pitch the activity stream. And right after that, once the questions are clarified, you can make the next steps and remove the towel from the user stories and present them each user story, and go again through each activity starting from the beginning. And then for each activity, you go into each user story that you have prepared. And you can decide for yourself if you want to go through all of them or only the ones for the MVP. I would recommend show them all, because then you have later better discussion on how the MVP should look like. And also make sure that a user story map is a high-level thing. We are not talking about user interfaces here. Don't fall into the trap of discussing how the solution will look like, because this is not necessarily clear. Because the user story map is first of all to align on the flow and what we want to build. And right after that, the hard work starts with sitting down with the engineers, sitting down with the design team, sketching out prototypes, testing them with customers, grouping the backlog tickets and making sure it gets ready for development. So it should be really on the higher level. The low level is going to happen afterwards when you go back working with your team. So this is what you're going to do. Depending on the feature size and also the complexity of your company, you maybe have a lot of stakeholders. Sometimes you just talk to the founder or to the VP product. I don't know, but plan at least an hour. Especially when you have multiple MVP versions, rather do 1.5. That's my experiences. So that was pitching it to your stakeholder. And now we're going to the next level, which is sharing it with your engineering team. And again, depending on how your company is structured and how big your company is, and also how autonomous you are allowed to work as a team, you can either, first of all, pitch it to the stakeholders or to your engineering team. I like always starting with my team, but I have also worked in environments where stuff is more bureaucratical and you have to start with the stakeholders first. Nevertheless, one of your engineers at least was involved in creating the whole user story map, which means you're not going behind of the back of your team because there was already someone involved. So again, here you pitch the feature. And after you've pitched the feature and answered questions, you again start with the user and the activity stream. Very simple. And you don't show them the user stories. What you're going to do next is a trick that I have learned from a very good coach. What you're going to do now is you're going to reveal all the user stories, but you don't go through each of them. What you're going to do is you make a breakout session. And you can, for example, if you are a team of 12 people, you can create 3 groups with 4 people each and say, guys, ladies and gentlemen, please take a look at the user stories, go through them, try to understand them, and add additional information. Add additional user stories. Add question marks if there's something you don't understand. Add additional things we need to research, or add bullet points or marks to a user story where you believe we have dependencies to other teams or other services. And don't make a breakout session longer than 10 to 15 minutes. Maybe they go through all of them, or maybe they just take the first 5 activities. That's something you need to figure out by yourself. So you can say, okay, let's make a 10-minute breakout and focus on the first 5 activities. Then we come together again and discuss for another 10 minutes, and then we make the next breakout. I highly recommend doing that. And at the beginning, I was like, all this crazy coaching tips, and now I have to do breakouts. It was worth it, I can tell you. It was really worth it because the team really thought in depth about the user stories. They had discussions between each other. They have identified a lot of dependencies to other teams. They have created additional user stories, which was amazing. So it can be very helpful. But make sure that you have a structured plan, time box the breakouts, discuss the open questions, and most important is, in case you're going to add new tickets or you have open questions, define follow-ups. So you as a product manager must be the person who's going to make sure that the team has everything they need to work on it, as well as your design partner. You can try it out. I recommend you giving the team the autonomy and the ability to take a look at it by themselves in a bigger session, because at the end of the day, the good thing is you start enabling communication and collaboration. So the team starts thinking about what you want to build. They start discussing it. They have a stake in it. They start also forming the feature with their ideas. And they maybe say, hey, Christian, you have this story and then afterwards this story, but we recommend you don't do both of them. We can take another story that was planned in the next release and we will cover all the upcoming releases with this one story because it makes technically more sense. You don't know that. So that's the reason why I usually like talking first of all to my engineers, because they can tell me in terms of effort what makes the most sense to be built first. For sure, you can change your mind if there are business reasons or customer reasons why you want to build something else first. But it's nice to understand, okay, how much effort it is to go with version A instead of version B or vice versa. So with that said, make sure you spend enough time with your stakeholders and especially your engineering team to understand the user story map, to pitch it well, to answer questions and let them collaborate on the whole creation process of that feature. We are reaching with this chapter the end of this online course.